Hello and welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, where we strive to grow in love of the Lord and each other. I'm Megan Silas.
And I am Pam Marvin.
And we are back and excited to be here together, gazing upon each other.
I know, it's good to
sharing
be
our
together.
hearts and minds. It is so good to be here.
Mm-hmm. So what's new with you? What's new?
What is new? Well, I'm kind of just sort of looking at the landscape of what's coming up in life, and we were talking recently before the show that I have been very remiss about going to get physicals. Mm-hmm. And so, a few episodes ago, we talked about, diet and exercise, and maybe we should have also talked about the reality of, kind of keeping a routine eye on what's up with your body through regular checkups. And, I, having been trained as a physician, I think is actually a stumbling block for me in this area, because I tend to be thinking that, well, if something were wrong, I would recognize it because I'm aware of symptoms and things like that of various problems. And so, I get kind of lazy. So I'm coming up soon. I'm going to have a physical for the first time in over 6 years.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit like, I'm not concerned actually at all about anything popping up. I'm just concerned about the number of labs and potential studies that the guy might want to do because it's been so long. And in particular, I don't want to get a colonoscopy. And I know back when I was training, it was more like when you were 50, that was kind of the guideline. And I'm not quite 50 yet. I'm very close. The term I use is tailgating 50. But and now it's quite a bit lower. And so I'm thinking about that reality. I'm thinking, like, what is it that really just makes me not want to do that? And it's really the prep. The bowel prep stuff. And so I'm trying to gear myself up to this idea of, maybe offering that up as a mortification. But then I also, the following week, am going to get my wisdom teeth out.
What?
Yeah. So I have been putting off, I wouldn't say putting off. I have been putting off the dentist telling me to get the wisdom teeth out because I wasn't having any problems with them. And I've kind of gotten in my head that this was sort of like a racket. Like they just tell you to get them out because why not? You might have problems with them in the future. So just get them out. And I'm like, well, God put these things in my head and my jaw and they're not bothering me. And so why should I go and have some sort of procedure to take out something that isn't causing a problem? Well, now I have a couple cavities back there and I do tend to bite my inside of my cheeks quite a bit. So I'm getting those out. So basically what's up with me is I'm contemplating future medical realities and I'm just not psyched about them, but I'm trying to get my mindset of using them as opportunities to, grow in, closeness to Christ and his passion and to offer them as a mortification and perhaps in maybe something will come up that I feel like I need to offer them in remission for or as a intercessory prayer thing. So, I'll just ask so some prayers for me as I go forward in these things that I would engage them in a holy way and not in a whiny way.
A well-ordered way.
Yes, there you go.
For sure.
So how about you?
October is a great month. My anniversary will be 34 years is coming up. And the beginning of the wedding festivities. So we have the first bridal shower coming up in October for my daughter, Annie. Very exciting times. Just kind of a lot going on. I'll be going up to a wedding to see a dear friend of mine. It is my goddaughter, but her aunt is one of my dearest friends of about 45 years plus. So that's really cool to have a friendship for that long. So I'm really thankful to God for her.
Beautiful. Well, the topic of the day is actually something that sort of came up as a potential topic to talk about in my own personal life. So we've talked many times about the fact that, I serve as a spiritual director. And sometimes in spiritual direction, things come up where I really feel compelled to encourage a directee to seek counseling with a licensed counselor, a therapist, or even a a psychiatrist, depending on what the issue is. And so I recognized recently, as I was listening to a podcast that has to do with kind of different techniques of counseling. I do like to educate myself about the world of psychology. I think...
which you have a background
I do
in.
have a background in, and I think that I want to have some practical knowledge of how the various approaches of psychology address issues within people, because as I come up on these things as a spiritual director, I want to be able to, have some understanding about, some different realities that might be going on there. So what I realized recently, as I was listening to a podcast that was talking about some psychology techniques, or therapeutic techniques and that kind of thing, is that while I have recommended to numerous people to seek counseling, I have never experienced counseling. And I felt kind of convicted that if I'm going to recommend something, maybe I ought to engage it, like maybe actually really experience what that is. And so I brought this to my husband and said, hey, I was really thinking about this and thinking that maybe I ought to, go for counseling and just sort of see what that is. And maybe, there are some things within my background and my way of thinking that probably could be addressed a little bit, that maybe I could grow in self-awareness and get some tools to function in a way that's healthier. And he had a really, I won't go so far as say negative response, but a really not positive response. Like, why would you do that? Isn't that just a waste of time? Like, isn't it, it's kind of, I think it might be kind of like just charlatan type things. I was really surprised. I did not realize that my spouse had such a negative attitude towards counseling and psychology. And so what it brought to mind for me, that it would be good to talk a little bit about what the differences between spiritual direction and counseling are, and maybe talk to some individuals within, the faith community that may have a negative attitude about counseling. I don't think that's where my husband's coming from necessarily, but I have definitely encountered among devout Christians sometimes a real either dismissiveness of the psychological sciences or an outright negativity, with this idea that psychology and psychologists are like evil or something, that they're contrary to the Christian faith, which I really disagree with. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about it.
Yeah.
But also to get your ideas on it and how you see it a little more.
Well, I think it is befitting for us to talk about what is spiritual direction first.
Okay.
So we can parse that out. I'll start because I'm sure you can embellish and you have more to say than I do.
Not necessarily.
No, the spiritual direction, the way I learned it, is really the relationship with the directee and God. That is the primary crux of it.
Absolutely.
Now, there are psychological things that can impede us from allowing that love in and so forth. That's where the other part comes in. But it is primarily circled around just that relationship, the prayer life, the sacramental life, interior life, and that. But I can see why during spiritual direction, times there will be things that come up that you're like, that's not really in the spiritual direction realm. That's more in the psychological realm.
Sure. Right. You're absolutely right. It is about the individual and how they're relating to God. One of the things that I would also say about spiritual direction is, while sometimes people will engage spiritual direction when they have some big thing that they're trying to discern or grapple with, spiritual direction tends to be almost, once you really engage it and you see the benefit of it, you're often, as if you're continually trying to grow in your relationship with the Lord, it'll be an ongoing thing where it's not like you're just trying to solve a problem and get the tools to do that and move on. It's really a constant process of understanding yourself, how you're relating to the Lord,
journeying back to God.
Journey, like we talked about in the last episode, actually, absolutely. So there's that element of it's not like have to be ordered towards a crisis point or anything like that. It's like a progressive, continuing accompaniment.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, as the two greatest commandments are to love God and love our neighbor, right? And so as we grow in holiness and desire to grow in holiness, we're going to desire to love God more and to love our neighbor more and better, right? And so often relationships will come up because we're struggling to love, right?
That reminds me of one thing. In early times of the podcast, in the first 10 episodes, there was something we used to say all the time, was that through relationships we are wounded, and through relationships we are healed. Did I say
absolutely.
that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
You said it exactly right, for sure. And so as those relationships and the struggles to love well, both God and others, come up in spiritual direction, what you will find sometimes is that the impediments to loving well come from places of brokenness that may need more exploration on a psychological level in conjunction with spiritual. Right. So I never see that counseling is not a substitute for spiritual direction, and spiritual direction is not a substitute for counseling.
No.
They can work beautifully in tandem.
Yes.
And that spiritual direction is going to be something that you're going to tend to maybe continue on more consistently and longer than counseling, but sometimes you may come up against this wall.
Yes.
And that counseling can really help break through the wall.
I just had this beautiful image come to mind.
Okay.
About, so let's say that our childhoods, our family of origin, and things that happen to us and the way we even perceive it, even if it's a harmlessness, it's still a knot. Mm-hmm. Like, you've heard of Mary Undoer of knots. Well, I see these kind of traumas, whether they are minor or not, to all of us, whatever it is pretty major if it changes a trajectory of our lives. Mm-hmm. So there's several different knots of things that have happened to us in our family of origin. And those are the knots primarily we need to work on with a psychologist to undo the knot so that then we can get closer to God in our relationship, because those knots are impeding our journey.
Right, absolutely. And it's not to be said that, if the Lord wants to, he can certainly in a moment just heal something, just remove it from you. But I actually think that he often wants to work with you in unraveling the knot, because the understanding being that knowing yourself more deeply and how you came to be who you are can actually help you be more fully the Christian you're meant to be. So we talk about how the Lord never allows something in our lives that he can't use for good, right? But if he just heals it with a miracle and we never come to understand what we had and why we had it, we won't necessarily be able to use what that experience was to grow and to maybe minister to others who've had other experiences.
Exactly.
And so that, I think, is a way that the Lord can often use this sort of growth that can come through a more gradual process of coming to understand where we came to be wounded, where we came to think in ways that were unhealthy, because unhealthy thinking about ourselves and others tends to translate into unhealthy behaviors toward ourselves and others.
Exactly.
And so that's really how I see counseling can be involved, because psychology can be used in ways that are negative. I think I'm going to completely acknowledge that. And this is why I think some people have sort of this maybe fear or apprehension.
Let me give you the perfect example, especially because we're Catholic.
If you've got the perfect example, go for it.
I do. So, I sent my friends who are really having a hard time in their marriage. They went to this counselor, and the counselor said, "You know what? You guys are not compatible. Y'all should get a divorce."
Right.
That's the kind of counseling we're like, well, that's not what we're looking for.
Yeah.
So that's, oh yeah, you need to affirm each other, or, just not a whole Christian worldview mindset.
Right. Yeah. And I'll take that term worldview and actually maybe tweak it a little bit and say a Christian anthropology. This is a term you'll hear a lot among Catholic counseling people, psychologists, and things like that. You need to function with a Christian anthropology, which means understanding the human person with an appropriate God view,
right?
Of who we are created to be, our dignity, what our ultimate goal is to be, with the Lord for all eternity, that the Lord does have plans for our lives, that the Lord created us and knows what's good for us and has given his commands through scripture and through his church for our flourishing, not to control us, but for us to flourish. Unless a psychologist or counselor is functioning out of that anthropology of what it means to be human, they're going to be very subject to leading down paths that are not appropriate.
Right.
And so I think instead of just throwing out counseling altogether and saying, it's a bunch of new age stuff or just a bunch of, people wanting to seek their own desires and throw off, morality or whatever. No, you got to vet. You got to vet the person you might go to.
For sure.
But so say we then say, okay, we've got this person who's well grounded in a strong Christian, even better Catholic anthropology, understanding of the human person. How can a counselor in practical ways impact a person that's maybe different than spiritual direction? And I would say it's in the practical tools that they have learned through their study.
I have one.
Okay.
So this is kind of a cute little sidebar. Family trip. We're floating on the tubes in the river. This, it's extended family. So this is my first cousin who has been in counseling. And she said something that was such a good nugget that she received in counseling, that feelings are data points and not directives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what a great insight that is. So I was able to go home and share with my teenagers, they're just data points. They're not directives.
Right.
And so that's the kind of a difference. Just this is how you process things.
Right. And they also have an understanding of various tendencies to function out of lies or wounds that are going to have some counterbalances that they can recommend, and to have this perspective of, when somebody has that experience, it's very common for someone to start thinking this or that. And this is some of the things that we've found have been effective in counteracting that tendency. And, generally when you're in counseling, there's a couple things that are going to be happening simultaneously. There's we need to get at what the root of these things are and come to understand those things and try to find healing. And healing ultimately comes from the Lord. So if you're not going to have, you can make progress even without God involved by just a greater degree of self-understanding and self-acceptance and things like that. But ultimately true healing is going to come from the Lord. So, to invite the Lord into those places. But, as I was saying, he doesn't always do that, with a snap of the fingers. So there's going to be so often time between when you're healing, you're healed to a degree that you're no longer functioning out of a wound, but you're still existing in your circumstances, and you need to have some practical tools to function as you're waiting for the healing to progress, right? And so that's what you're going to end up doing in counseling is as this healing is going on, and that's the place that I think is there's so much tandem with the spiritual director and the counselor. The practical tool aspect of, okay, as I wait for this healing, as I, desire and do the work that I need to do in order to, help facilitate the healing that the Lord wants to do in my life, how do I function right now in a way that I'm capable of with the circumstances that I have? And that can be very empowering to think, all right, Well, I don't have to just wait until I'm healed to start behaving in a way that's healthier. And that's I think the biggest benefit that counseling gives. Whereas I, as a spiritual director, haven't been trained as much in these practical tools for functioning in circumstances as we wait for healing.
Right. So I can see how they do work in tandem.
Oh,
for
absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. Because we can't ignore parts of ourselves.
Right. And there's times during spiritual direction that you're starting to uncover something that's behind that, maybe a trauma from childhood and whatnot, that then needs to be taken.
Right. And that, I think that's a good point. Like, so for me as a spiritual director, what are some of the things that might trigger me to say to a person, I think you need to seek some counseling here? What triggers me for that is when I see repetitive patterns of behavior that are disordered or causing significant disruption in the person's life, and they can't seem to understand why they're doing it. I'm working with them, asking them questions, having them pray on it, but they just really seem to be kind of blocked. If I can be very patient with that circumstance as far as making the progress of them coming to understanding. But if I'm seeing in their life significant disruption as far as how they're relating to others or, in their work or things like that, this is when I say, you know what? You need some more tools about how to function in this reality as we continue to seek God's healing for a place that we might not even uncovered yet. Right. So that would be a place. If I see any behaviors that are self-injuring,
of course,
or dangerous in any way to themselves or others, that's a place where I'm going to want to get some help.
Right. The other thing, Megan, that I've noticed myself as being in conversations in spiritual guidance is someone who, I think I'm just repeating it in just a different way, that there's a lack of progress. There's a lack of insight, and there's a lack of progress in trying to grow closer to God. They clearly have a very strong desire, but there's like doors they're not willing to open.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah. They kind of shut down. It's just kind of the same thing over and over and over again.
I'm glad you made the point though, where you said but they really have a strong desire, because if I see lack of progress, that's the thing I need to discern. Yeah. Is there lack of progress simply because there's not commitment to prayer life and really seeking the Lord? Like, if that's it, sometimes people just aren't ready for spiritual direction.
That is so true.
You know what I mean? Like, they're just not in a place where they're really consistently
and open and vulnerable.
But with a dedication and desire to seek the Lord, then you're not going to see a lot of progress there. But if they do have that, they really want to, but they just seem to be, like you said, they've got doors that are closed, and they don't even, and you see that they're closed, you know that you're shut off in areas, but they don't seem to recognize that. Or even if you kind of tiptoe close to it with some questioning, you have some very strong reactions that like are running away. That makes me think that there's probably some maybe trauma there that they need somebody who has training to try to engage. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, it's the being stuck.
A third place where I would say that I really am quick to recommend counseling is if they're in a relationship with someone who seems to clearly have some significant issues with their psychology. Because say addiction, abusive behaviors of somebody else, really strong controlling behaviors, things, if they're describing people in their lives that maybe have significant evidence of a personality disorder. If there's close relationships in their life with this person that seems to have some really strong issues, they need help. They need tools that I don't have.
Right. Perfect. That's wonderful. Just if you're listening to this today, we're going to try something new. and you would like a recommendation for a good, solid Catholic or Christian psychologist, message us on our shoulder word number 2 shoulder on our Facebook page, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, would be happy to do that. There's some really good groups of counselors.
Wherever you are, online, Zoom, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's available.
And one of the beautiful things, perhaps we can thank COVID for it. We haven't had a lot to thank that for, but that this openness to video conference calls with counseling and things like that has really exploded in the last couple of years. And that really gives people a lot more options to access a good counselor or psychologist when they might not have been able to otherwise.
Or spiritual guide.
Or spiritual guide, yeah. There are spiritual guides that do that now. I don't do that so much, but I know that there's definitely people who do. So yeah, those are good options. And I would just say, if you're in any of those circumstances where you know for a fact that you have significant trauma in your history and you've never really gone into addressing it with a professional, I just really want to encourage you to consider doing that. If you're in a relationship that's abusive and when I say abusive, don't just jump to physical abuse. There's a lot of emotional, psychological abuse that can happen in relationships that can be very, very damaging. And so if you have ever felt like maybe you were in an abusive situation, or maybe you haven't really recognized that, but somebody in your life has says, hey, I think that this is an emotional abusive situation. Like, don't ignore that. Mm-hmm. And the reality is the Lord will work with us and with all these different options to bring about healing, because he wants to use other people to be part of our healing. And those other people might be someone like a counselor or a psychologist. So yeah, just if you have just a blanket negativity about this area, I just want to encourage you to maybe reconsider that and pray about that. And if this is kind of, bringing up something in you where you're feeling like, oh my gosh, maybe I could use this. Listen to that. Don't ignore it. Don't run away from it. And if you have a spiritual director, talk frankly with your spiritual director about and say just, hey, have you ever thought, maybe I could use some counseling or I'm thinking maybe I could go to counseling. What do you think about that? And just talk through that with either a spiritual director or a spiritual friend. Maybe a spiritual friend has seen some things and, just didn't feel like maybe you were ready to hear it or that they had the words to say it. But if you bring it up, they might be like, yeah, I have seen some things. So that would be my encouragement. I think we should use all the tools that the Lord has given us in order to grow in our human formation, our spiritual formation, and to become more and more fully alive. Because the glory of God is man fully alive and woman too.
Amen.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for joining us, and we hope this episode has blessed you. And I would say, particularly if there's maybe somebody on your heart that you're a friend of or relative of or someone that is just kind of made you think, oh, I think this person could use it, consider sharing it. And we just thank you for sharing this time with us. It's been a blessing for us to be able to share this time with each other. And we hope that you will remain united with us in prayer until next time. God bless.
God bless.